Hello, everyone. Okay, so this is part two of Hubris. Today is the 19th of November 2025, and yesterday I posted a video, and I thought I was going to be able to cover everything I wanted to say. And so I told you how I would start with the ancient classical writers on the question of hubris, and I would bring it all the way down to modern psychology and modern politics or political philosophy. But it went on, and I had to cut it at the hour. So I'm going to do a part two today and now concentrate especially on on modern day understanding of hubris by going through different psychological theories and political philosophy. Okay, so first of all, I urge you, please, that I told you that the channel is called Interpreting Tradition. I told you this in the last video, and I said I'll bring the tradition and you do the interpreting, okay? Because especially with the politics, I'm not going to name anyone specifically, but it's for you to think of today's age and you know how you might interpret it. Okay, so I'm going to start first though with a recap. I urge you to watch part one because everything will make more sense. Okay, let me just recap, if I can do it in 5 minutes, what we covered yesterday, especially what we covered in terms of from the Greeks to the Romans. I will leave that aside, and to recap the medieval Catholic theologians. I specifically talked about Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, who actually anticipated modern psychology with the 12 steps. Remember? So now let me just recap all this. So the central medieval insight in the ancient world, hubris was a human catastrophe. In the Middle Ages, it became something far more dangerous, a supernatural rebellion, a sickness that begins in the heart and ends in the heavens. For the medieval mind, pride did not merely destroy cities and countries and the self, as the ancient told us, but for the medieval mind, pride was the first sin. You remember St. Augustine? Okay, the root of all others, the moment when a creature says to the Creator, I will be the measure of myself. Self-deification, as St. Augustine said. So the Middle Ages took the Greek idea of hubris and carried it into the depths of the soul. So, for example, with St. Augustine and the great reversal, before the Middle Ages truly begins, St. Augustine of Hippo cast the shadow under which all the later thinkers stand. He writes that pride is the love of one's own excellence. And in this love, he says, the soul turns inward on itself, shutting its eyes to God. That is the medieval shift. Pride is no longer simply excess, but it is an inversion, a world turned upside down inside a single human heart. So for St. Augustine, from him onward, the question was no longer simply what does pride do, but what does pride want to be? And the answer is always the same. It wants to be its own God. Then we move on to the structure, to Saint Gregory the First, the Gregory the Great, Dionysius, Saint Anselm. So after Saint Augustine, the early medieval masters built an architecture around this insight. So we saw that Gregory the Great placed pride at the top of the seven deadly sins, calling it the queen of vices, the mother of disobedience, the mother of vanity. This is all pride, arrogance, the mother of ambition, the mother of despair. And then we saw that with Pseudo Dionysius, in a voice that is sort of half Christian and half Neo-Platonist. He called pride a disorder in the cosmic hierarchy, the hierarchy with God at the top there. Every being has its place, and pride is the creature that attempts to ascend beyond its order, beyond its measure. We are getting psychological here already. For Saint Anselm of Canterbury, he gave a rational explanation. Pride is the will seeking exaltation from itself. Every medieval thinker took these ideas and every one of them deepened them. But no one shaped the medieval vision of pride like Saint Bernard of Clairvaux and the Victorines, very famous in mystical contemplative theology. Hugh of Saint Victor and Richard of Saint Victor, and also the seraphic doctor, Saint Bonaventure. Hugh of Saint Victor lived in a cloister beside the Seine, a master of contemplative theology, a man who charted the inner landscape of the soul with a clarity that still feels very modern when you read him. He wrote, "The first and chief cause of sin is that a man does not know himself." This is the heart of his philosophy. Pride begins in ignorance. You're going to see the connection to modern psychology in a second. Pride begins in ignorance, not of the world, but of the truth of one's own condition. And he continues, when man knows not what he is, he desires to be what he is not. And thus arises pride, the love of one's own false greatness. For Huge, pride is identity gone wrong, a soul forgetting its origin, forgetting its limits, forgetting its measure, he calls it. He describes pride as a violent misordering inside the soul. And he says, what ought to be subject becomes Lord, and what ought to be Lord, it subjects. So the will rises above reason, desire rises above truth, the self rises above God. This is hubris in its medieval form, not self-confidence, but this is amazing psychologically, he calls it self-usurpation, theft. And the punishment is blindness. When pride enters, the light departs. Pride, he says, is a cloud before the eyes of the mind. And this metaphor becomes central to medieval spirituality. Pride is darkness. Humility is sight. Darkness, sight. It's not the world that becomes dark, it is the human heart. The Victorian psychology of hubris is this. Hugh expands the theme in his book, The Mystic Arc, The Mystic Arc. using the image of the biblical flood to describe the soul's interior drama. He writes, "He who desires to be greater than he is refuses the measure given him by God. This refusal is pride. This measure, mensura, is everything for you. To refuse your measure is to refuse reality itself, truth, reality itself. And this refusal leads, he says, to profound loneliness in the heart. The proud man cannot love, for he loves only himself. And whoever loves only himself is alone, though he may be surrounded by a multitude. So hubris isolates you. It builds a tiny kingdom with one single emperor and one single king and one single subject, myself, and a single tyrant. The Greek tragedians feared hubris because it destroyed cities. It destroyed, you remember, in generations, nations. The medieval theologians fear it because it destroyed souls. And no one understood this better than a Franciscan who would try to map the soul's return to God, Saint Bonaventure, the blind soul. He inherited from St. Augustine the fire. The Victorians inherited the psychology. From Dionysius, he inherited the mysticism. He begins his journey of the mind into God with a warning. The soul cannot ascend to God unless the veil of pride is torn away. No flight of the mind is possible if pride waits the wings. And he continues, pride darkens the eye of the mind, and the light of the first principle therefore cannot enter in. This echoes Hugh, yet St. Bonaventure adds a new dimension here. Pride is not only blindness, it is a refusal of illumination. He goes deeper and deeper, a refusal of light, a refusal of grace. In his commentary on the sentences by Lombard, he writes, pride is the turning of the creature towards itself and away from God. It is the inordinate elevation of the created will. So for Bonaventure, pride is metaphysical theft, the creature stealing glory that belongs only to the Creator. And this is why all sin begins with pride, because all sin involves a refusal, he says, a refusal to receive. Bonaventure describes the proud soul as a soul in exile. Pride casts the soul out of its true homeland. The homeland of the soul is God. To be proud is to be homeless. To be humble is to return home. In the triple way, he writes, thus pride is exile and humility the beginning of return. This theme becomes central to medieval mysticism. Pride is wandering about, humility is homecoming. In the tree of life, Bonaventure draws the ultimate contrast. Pride wishes to be exalted. Humility chooses to descend. Pride seeks a crown. Humility embraces the cross. So, all right, so the moral cosmos of the Middle Ages is, to recap, for Augustine, pride is self-deification. For Gregory the Great, pride is the queen of vices. For Dionysius, pride is cosmic disorder. For Saint Anselm, pride is the will seeking its own exaltation. For Hugh of Saint Victor, pride blinds, isolates, destroys measure. For Saint Bonaventure, pride is exile from the divine homeland. Each voice reveals a different facet of the same truth, that pride is the soul turned against its own source. Hubris is the creature claiming a throne that it cannot bear, it cannot sustain it. So hubris, superbia, remember the word arrogance together with disdain for others is the root from which all ruin grows. And humility, the medieval antidote, is the antidote to pride, obviously. And they explain humility is not self-hatred. It is not self-abasement in that sense. It is self-truth, a return to measure, to clarity, to light. So in Greece, hubris was punished by fate. In Rome, you remember, is punished by political collapse. But in the Middle Ages, hubris was punished by something far greater, by reality itself. For a creature cannot become its own God without becoming its own ruin. So the medieval theologians understood this intimately and perfectly. Pride is blindness. Pride is exile. Pride is inversion. Pride is the root of all sin, because pride is the soul refusing to be what it is. And the moment the soul refuses its truth, it falls. Not because God pushes it, but because nothing created can stand on a foundation made of itself. Okay, so that is the recap of the previous video. Okay, let's bring now hubris to today's world. I'm going to start with psychology and the different psychological theories, and then move on to politics. And at the end, how the powerful use proxies to do their bidding, and how the the um, the extent of manipulation, or the form, the way they manipulate their proxies, it's different whether, as to whether they are men or women. You manipulate those people who are proxies for their power in different ways. That will be the end of the video. Let's now go back to psychology. And I hope you remember from the first video, Saint Bernard of Clairvaux with the 12 steps, because that was pure psychology, if you remember. Okay, and all right, let's move on. The mind that outgrows itself. We are in modern psychological theories. So, in the ancient world, hubris was a crime against the gods. In the Middle Ages, it was a rebellion against the Creator. But in our time, hubris has become something else. We are going to forget God here, we're going to forget sin, we're going to all that, okay? The language of today. It has become something else, a psychological phenomenon, a glitch in the architecture of the mind, a distortion of self-perception. Notice the different language already. That a distortion, that self-perception that can destroy careers, relationships, institutions, and sometimes entire nations. Modern psychology does not speak of hubris as the Greeks did, or as the medieval theologians did, but it studies the same, if you like, inner force under different names. It's going to call it grandiosity. It's going to call it overconfidence, bias, illusory superiority, narcissistic inflation, self-serving cognition, the hero fantasy of the isolated self. It is a pattern in the human brain. We're no longer talking of the soul. So the cognitive foundation, they tell us, psychologists, we are actually wired to overestimate ourselves. This is perfectly natural. Instinctively, we want to, or we need to, overestimate ourselves. How do we do this? Okay, three of the most robust findings in psychological science can be summarized very simply. One, people think that they are always smarter than they are. People believe that they are more virtuous than they are. People think they are more in control than they are. And you say, what? No, I don't think I'm more virtuous than anybody else, really. But no, step by step. We actually do. Researchers call these the better than average effect. Most people think that they are above average at honesty, intelligence, driving skills, generosity, which is logically impossible, but it is psychologically universal. This is how they explain it. Hubris begins here. If you remember the medievals and even the ancient Greeks, begins here a small silent inflation of the self, invisible, imperceptible at first, but then growing into an entire worldview. Two researchers, Dunning and Kruger, there is something called the Dunning I don't know whether he's pronounced Dunning or Dunning, he's with the U, Dunning-Kruger insight, when ignorance feels like expertise. In 1999, psychologists David Dunning and Justin Kruger made a disturbing discovery. What was this discovery? You're going to laugh, but it is true. It sounds very simple. The less people know, the more certain they feel. The less people know, the more certain they feel. And we all react, yeah, we know that already. What is this discovery? No, it's how they explain it. They say this is not arrogance necessarily. It is cognitive illusion. In order to explain it, it makes sense logically, right? When people lack knowledge, they also lack the ability to recognize their lack of knowledge. So it is an ignorance invisible from the inside. You cannot possibly know what you don't know, yeah? So this is the psychology of the amateur who believes he's a master, the politician who speaks without understanding, the leader whose confidence is sometimes inversely proportional to competence. Hubris is not always a conscious choice. Sometimes it's a blind spot made of certainty. Remember the theologians saying it's like a cloud in the soul. Okay, it's a blind spot made of certainty. Now, the hubris syndrome, there is something called the hubris syndrome, power as a cognitive drug. Modern political psychology gives hubris a precise name, the hubris syndrome. is a term developed by psychiatrist David Owen and political scientist Jonathan Davidson. It describes leaders who, after they come into power, acquiring power, begin to display a sort of symptoms, a cluster of symptoms. Among them, grandiose self-vision of themselves, contempt for advice, an impulse to dominate, belief in personal, practically infallibility, excessive confidence in risky decisions, isolation from dissent. You're already powerful. You don't want to hear those people over there. But isolation from any dissent. And actually a moral exemption too. The rules no longer apply to them in the same way as they apply to everybody else. So power, real concentrated power, they say, these psychologists, changes the brain. It dulls empathy with others. It disrupts any vision, this over self-confidence. It inflates certainty. The Greeks said that whom the gods wish to destroy, they first make proud. You remember? So modern neuroscience says, whom power wishes to destroy, it first alters their prefrontal cortex, kind of thing. All right. So for them, for these psychologists, hubris is not a moral failing, it's a neurological side effect. Now, let's look at social psychology, the illusion of better morality, superior morality. One of the most unsettling findings in moral psychology is this. People believe they are morally better than almost everyone they know. And we all react against it. No, not really. I don't think I'm morally better. But listen to this explanation. They think they're morally better than the others, not because the others necessarily are evil. We're dealing with psychology here. Not because the others are evil, but because morality is seen from the inside out. We judge ourselves by our intentions, but we judge others by their actions. And here is the difference. Us by our intentions, others by their actions. I believe they are onto something here. In other words, I cut corners and do certain things that I shouldn't be doing, but I meant well. My intention was good. They, the others, cut corners too because they're corrupt. I failed here because of this particular circumstance, this particular reason. This is why I failed. The others failed because of their character. Do you see? So hubris lives in this asymmetry, a belief that the self is good, almost pure sometimes, that we are we have a justification for what we do. Yes, we see ourselves as an exception. This is the psychology of moral inflation. This is a secular echo of what we discussed with the medieval theologians, the superbia. You remember arrogance. All right, now let's move on to personality psychology beyond narcissism. Modern psychology distinguishes three forms of inflated self. One is grandiose narcissism. They describe grandiose narcissism as this person who is bold, charming, dominant, loves admiration, avoids shame. He's never ashamed. He avoids shame because he denies weakness, avoids shame by denying weakness. That is grandiose narcissism. Now, there is another kind of narcissism, vulnerable narcissism. That is almost the opposite, terribly, terribly self-centered, defensive, hypersensitive. And here I'm going to crave validation from others. I'm also going to avoid shame, not because I deny my weakness, but because I hide them. There is another one, hubristic pride, it is called, is distinct from narcissism. This was identified by Jessica Tracy's research, and this is a chronic sense of superiority, contempt for others, belief in one's own natural importance, no need for admiration. I don't need your admiration. I can do without it. Just, I want you to recognize my dominance. This third category, this hubristic pride, is actually the closest psychological equivalent to the ancient Greek hubris. It is cold, it is detached, it is self-contained. It does not seek followers, only submission. It's pride without neediness. It is supremacy without any affection or empathy. Let's look at evolutionary psychology now. Hubris as a social strategy. From an evolutionary perspective, hubris is not merely a flaw, it is a strategy. It is inherent in us, say the psychologist. Dominant individuals in early human groups survive by projecting confidence. We all followed the greatest hunter naturally, instinctively. Yeah. So dominant individuals survive by projecting this confidence. Whether the confidence was accurate or not, to us instinctively, confidence signals competence. The mind responds to certainty, not to truth, instinctively. So we follow the confident one, yeah? So therefore, evolution equipped us with some psychological tools. Confidence inflation, dominance display, denial of personal limitations. These were once good survival traits, this confidence, yeah? But in modern societies, we are no longer hunting. We no longer depend on instinct, just instinct. So in modern societies, they often become dysfunctions. Why? Because the same instincts that helped a tribe follow a decisive hunter nowadays can mislead a company or a movement or a nation because we tend to follow the loudest voice in the room that appears as confident. He may be the most ignorant, but it is the loudest, perhaps the most ignorant. but the loudest voice in the room. In other words, it's as if evolution is running in outdated software. Now, the fall, when the self collapses under its own weight, something that we saw in the medieval theologians. Psychologically, hubris fails for three reasons. Modern psychologists tell us. Why? Number one, reality always pushes back. Overconfidence eventually meets actual limits, reality. The internal fantasy meets external constraints. That's number one. Number two, relationships collapse. Hubris erodes trust. It narrows, constricts, suffocates empathy with others, and destroys cooperation. And number three, then, the self shatters. The inflated self-image becomes too large to sustain, for us to bear. When it breaks violently, shatters. It could be through humiliation or loss or addiction or burnout or sudden reversal of fortune. Hubris here is not punished by the gods or the angels, it's punished by the laws of cognition. The fall is not metaphysical for psychology, it is structural. So the modern cosmos of hubris, if we bring together all these insights of contemporary psychology, for Dunning-Kruger, ignorance creates false confidence. Cognitive bias is we overestimate our virtue and ability and talent. Social psychology, we justify ourselves and condemn others. Personality science, hubristic pride is a stable trait. Evolutionary psychology, dominance displays shaped human history. And clinical observation, power inflates the mind. And so the conclusion becomes clearer. Hubris is the mind's war against reality. It is a distortion of perception. It's a miscalibration of the self. The theologians were saying that, you remember? A miscalibration of the self, a psychological intoxication with one's own imagined greatness. And like every other intoxication, the crash is going to be inevitable. So to conclude a little bit, the final law, the ancient says the hubris always has a nemesis, a formidable rival or opponent who is difficult to defeat. Modern psychology says the same in different terms, obviously. Distortion brings collapse. Illusion brings correction. Inflation brings rupture. Hubris is not punished from above here, but it is punished by the very structure of the mind. Every human being lives between two forces. Psychology says the desire to become more than you are, and the danger of becoming too much. So the story of hubris, from ancient myth to medieval theology to modern psychology, is the story of what happens when the self expands beyond its own foundations and limitations, that you can no longer hold. Let's look now, leave psychology and go to political philosophy. When pride becomes a system, hubris is not only a psychological flaw and not only a spiritual disorder, it is also a political force, one of the oldest and most dangerous forces in human history. Political philosophers saw it long before modern psychology did. For them, hubris is not just a personal sin, obviously, but a structural fault inside governments and rulers and states and revolutions and nations. Wherever power accumulates, hubris grows always in its shadow. And the great political thinkers spent centuries trying to understand how societies rise through wisdom and then fall through pride. Let's look at the classical roots first. Hubris as political decay. Plato, obviously, the tyrant's soul. Plato saw hubris as the final stage in the degeneration of the political soul of the people. He said democracy, in its excessive love of freedom, he warned, gives birth to the tyrant. The tyrant grows from the root of the democratic man's unbounded liberty. Tyranny for Plato is hubris made political, the soul that refuses limit, becoming the ruler the ruler who refuses law. The tyrant believes himself godlike, and in that belief he is going to destroy the city and the nation. That was Plato. Aristotle sees hubris as the abuse of power. He gives a precise definition. Hubris is to shame another for one's own pleasure. He saw hubris not as emotion, but as action, a deliberate misuse of power. In politics, hubris is the moment when authority, genuine authority, becomes domination. Law becomes the whim of the emperor, and pride becomes cruelty. This insight will echo through every later political thinker. Let's move on to the Renaissance. Renaissance realism. The hubris in The Prince, of Machiavelli. The fall of overconfident rulers. Machiavelli rarely uses the word pride, but that idea is there in The Prince all over the place. His warning is clear. Rulers fail because they believe the world will obey their confidence. Machiavelli is not moralizing here, he is observing. The ruler who ignores reality, who trusts his brilliance too much, who refuses advice, who overestimates his power and his control, that ruler is inevitably going to fail. He's not moralizing, don't do it because he's wrong. No, he's just saying that's the reality of the thing. You're going to fall. You refuse to listen, you're going to fall. This is political hubris, stripped of theology. This is real politics. Another thinker, Guicciardini, the pride and the illusion of glory, he was one of Machiavelli's contemporaries, and he was even more explicit. He wrote that princes fall not because they are wicked, he said, but because they are enchanted by their own fortune. which is saying that, the same thing with different words. Men, he said, are more apt to be deceived. Listen to this. This is a quote from him. Men are more apt to be deceived by prosperity than by adversity. Not by suffering, you're not deceived. By prosperity and good fortune, that is when you're going to start mistaking things. So hubris in this view is prosperity turned into delusion. How about the social contract tradition? Pride as civic corruption. Hobbes, the English thinker. Pride as the seed of civil war. Hobbes saw pride, vainglory, as the greatest political threat. Yeah. He said, men measure themselves by comparison with others. And from this comparison arises rivalry, ambition, war. Of course, he explains it in great detail. For Hobbes, hubris is the psychological origin of political chaos. The state exists to control pride, to suppress the violent desire to be superior to others. Rousseau talked about amour-propre, the birth of inequality. He made it the pride, the engine of modern society. He did distinguish very well in the French language between amour de soi, natural self-love is almost an instinct of self-preservation, and amour propre, false, the competitive, comparative pride that drives inequality, competition, ambition, envy. He writes, civilization begins where men begin to look at one another and wish to be looked at in return. He was looking at it as a good thing. Civilization was, cities were what made man bad. The noble savage was a good man. It is civilization, he said, that turned man bad, wicked. So hubris in Rousseau's analysis is not a private flaw, but it is for him was the foundation of the social order. We're going to disagree with that. Society itself is built on the desire to be admired. Let's move on to the Enlightenment critique, pride as political illusion. Montesquieu, hubris of despotism. Montesquieu warned that every form of concentrated power tends towards excess. Despotism, he wrote, is the political form of hubris, the ruler who believes all power flows from him. So we need moderation, separation of powers, checks and balances. These were invented precisely, he says, as mechanical antidotes to political pride and tyranny. David Hume, the Scottish thinker, Pride and the Era of States. Hume saw pride not only in rulers, but in nations. National pride, he argued, is a cognitive distortion, a collective self-flattery that leads states and nations into overreach, into war, and then ruin. Hubris then is no longer individual, it becomes collective. How about 19th century? Hubris of reason and revolution, Alexis de Tocqueville. democratic hubris. Tocqueville observed that democracies face a unique form of pride, the belief, he argued in the 19th century, that majority opinion is infallible. This, he warned, leads to the you've heard it before, the tyranny of the majority, a mass hubris that crushes dissent. Tocqueville saw another danger. Democracies believe themselves immune to decline, immune to fall, because the majority rules. How can you possibly go wrong? This belief is itself the beginning of the fall, of the decline of the nation. How about Nietzsche? Hubris as the will to power. Nietzsche reframed hubris not as vice, but as the natural human urge to expand our power. But Nietzsche also saw political hubris very clearly. That is why I don't believe Nietzsche's power and all this. I think he was wounded. I think it's a pose. I know he gives terrific reasons for his philosophy, but nevertheless, political hubris clearly he saw as when a people imagines itself chosen, destined, pure, infallible, and this, he said, prepares it for its own catastrophe. Nietzsche admired power, but he understood that self-deification, whether in individuals or nations, inevitably leads to ruin. So we see that the modern moment of hubris as a systemic failure. Political philosophers today see hubris in technocratic overconfidence, ideological purity, nationalism's mythic self-image, overreach by the experts, surveillance states, digital dictatorships, social media mobs, charismatic populism, utopian promises, the illusion of permanent progress. We are getting better and better. The structures change, the pattern does not change. Whenever a system believes it is too exceptional to fail, that is the beginning. Failure is already on the way. The final lessons of political hubris: power without limit becomes blind. Blind power destroys itself always. Hubris is the political force that makes rulers deaf, that makes nations reckless, that makes societies fragile. Politics is the art of placing constraints around the natural human impulse to overreach. And the story of political philosophy is the story of humanity's attempt to build systems strong enough to survive this, its own pride. So hubris in modern political philosophy, just to bring it all together, hubris has never left human affairs. But in the modern world, it takes new forms: less myth, less God, more ideology, more systems, more reason. From revolutionary fervor to nationalist ambition, from totalitarian ideology to technocratic overreach, from modern political thinkers modern political thinkers have tried to diagnose the disease of political pride, the hubris that turns idealism into oppression, ambition into catastrophe. So modern hubris is secular, structural, systemic. It is the arrogance of knowing too much sometimes, controlling too much, promising too much, excess. It is ideology on steroids. It is the engine of some of the greatest tragedies of the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries. We saw Alexis de Tocqueville, the democratic pride. He saw a new form of hubris in the rise of democracy. His quote is, "The majority believes itself infallible. It risks, when it does that, it risks crushing the minority under the weight of its own certainty." So for Tocqueville, modern hubris is collective. It is not an individual ruler's arrogance, but the massive self-confidence of a people. Democratic societies, he warns, can be blind to their own limitations too. Nations can be blind to their own limitations, and of course empires. And hubris, even in freedom, it's still hubris. Karl Marx saw it as historical determinism. In other words, historical certainty. The belief that history follows predictable, deterministic laws, and that one ideology can control outcomes. This is the political equivalent of hubris. Even when aimed at justice, this confidence can justify suppression, coercion, violence. Even if you thought that you were fighting for quality, fighting against inequality, for justice, it will lead to suppression and coercion and violence. So hubris becomes an instrument of inevitability, a sacred certainty that overrides everything else. John Maynard Keynes, the economist, he wrote about the hubris of control. In economics and political planning, he said, Keynes saw that modern hubris, he saw it in technocratic interventions. The attempts to manage the economy as if it were a machine. This, he said, can produce instability and crisis because human beings are not cogs in a machine. So societies are not machines. Hubris in policy is overconfidence in control, an illusion that one can manage complexity perfectly. Other thinkers today, in the late 20th and 21st centuries, hubris as global power. Michel Foucault, hubris as knowledge. Foucault locates modern hubris in what he called epistemic power. What is that? Power is not merely political, it is your ability to define truth. The ability of whoever, the government, this institution, they define what is truth. imagine. So modern hubris manifests itself when institutions believe that they possess absolute knowledge about crime, absolute knowledge about health, absolute knowledge about the economy and about society itself. This is the arrogance of surveillance, of data-driven control, the assumption that humans can be fully quantified, fully predicted, and fully corrected. Another thinker, Jürgen Habermas, the hubris of communication and rationality. Habermas warns of hubris in rational planning, consensus building, when political elites assume that rational discourse alone can produce perfect social order. When they do that, they risk alienating citizens, undermining democracy, creating systems that are brittle, not resilient, brittle. Modern hubris is no longer personal. It is collective, it is systemic, it is technological, it is institutional. So the lessons of modern hubris. Across the modern era, hubris appears again and again. Democratic societies overestimate their virtue. Ideologies claim historical inevitability. Leaders and institutions overestimate knowledge and control. Nations act as if power absolves responsibility. Lack of accountability. Science and technology are treated as ultimate arbiters of social order. Goodness. And this pattern is unmistakable. Certainty breeds arrogance, and arrogance invites collapse. Modern political philosophy shows that hubris is not just a moral failing, really. It is structural, it is psychological, and it is institutional. It is a law of systems as much as of souls, not that I care too much for souls. So the modern law of falling and decline. In theology, hubris brings divine punishment. In psychology, it brings cognitive failure. In politics, it brings, how do we call this? Catastrophe. It brings history. Power, certainty, and pride are a combustible combination. Power, certainty, pride. Oh my goodness, there you have it. Unchecked hubris may create temporary dominion or dominance, but it sows in itself, it sows the seeds of failure, of collapse, and of ruin. And the lesson for us is clear. We have to watch our institutions. We have to question certainties. We have to check our leaders. We have to recognize the limits of knowledge and control. For hubris is not punished just by God or by myth. It is punished by reality itself. And in modern times, the consequences are collective and systemic and global. So, from the mind to the state or to politics or to the nation, the architecture of pride. Before I move on to proxies, male and female. Hubris begins quietly in the human mind. I'm dealing with current ideologies, with theories, with psychology and politics. Hubris begins quietly in the human mind. It's a whisper. I am better than others. I am capable beyond measure. I can control what others cannot control. Psychologists call it illusory superiority, overconfidence bias, the Dunning-Kruger effect. Cognitive science shows us that nearly everyone at some point overestimates their own competence, their morality, and their control. But what happens when these individual distortions, what happens when they enter the corridors of power? What happens when the private inflation of the mind becomes public and systemic and global? Then hubris becomes political. This is the story of pride, ambition, overreach, from the neurons in your brain that they tell us about to the towering institutions of nations. The psychology of hubris, this cognitive bias and self-deception. Humans are wired to overestimate themselves. We think we are smarter, kinder, braver than reality shows. We believe our intentions justify our actions. We perceive others through outcomes, ourselves through motives. Hubris begins as a miscalibration of perception. The brain inflates the self just enough to give confidence. Confidence was adaptive in evolutionary terms. It helped leaders and hunters and innovators succeed, but it also sowed the seeds of overreach. So, in the Dunning-Kruger and blind certainty thesis, the less we know, the more confident we feel. Ignorance, it turns out, is invisible to the ignorant. They act decisively, sometimes brilliantly, but just as often catastrophically. This is the private form of hubris. Certainty without competence, illusion masquerading as insight. Hubris as syndrome of power. So when individuals gain authority and power, psychology magnifies power. Power transforms the brain. Leaders become impulsive, isolated, overconfident. They stop listening. They stop questioning. This is hubris for psychologists. This is hubris made neurological, a systemic flaw in the individual mind amplified by social position. Now, hubris enters politics. The individual becomes political. Political philosophy observes the same pattern on a larger scale. Plato saw the tyrant's soul, the mind unrestrained becoming a city and a nation unrestrained. Machiavelli warned of rulers who overestimate their control, trusting their brilliance more than their reality. Tocqueville saw democracies believe in themselves morally infallible and warned of mass hubris crushing dissent. In each case, the psychological patterns of self-deception, overconfidence, and moral inflation become structural risks in society. Now, hubris as a collective phenomenon. Well, I think I'll move on. The modern lessons, the global consequences. Hubris scales from a single overconfident leader to a party, to a nation, to a supranational system. Unchecked, it produces wars, environmental collapse, economic crisis, social instability. The psychology of the individual mind becomes political entropy. Psychology and political philosophy converge in one undeniable insight. Overconfidence leads to error. Moral inflation leads to cruelty. Isolation leads to rigidity. Power magnifies what, so all that is there, but then you have power, and that is going to magnify all these effects. The modern world is full of examples: overreaching governments, failed revolutions, technocratic overreach, ideological extremism. The pattern is always the same. Hubris distorts perception. Hubris inflates ambition. Hubris ignores limits. We're talking about politics and psychology. Dare I bring humility into it? Well, is hubris universal? What is its antidote? Psychologists call it not humility, they call it, wait for the word, metacognition. Oh, okay. Metacognition, the ability to reflect on one's own thinking. Humility, political philosophers call it checks and balances, deliberation, institutional constraints. But both converge on the same principle, call it what you will. To survive, the mind and the state must recognize limits. Just like the church tells us that, the soul, we must recognize our own limits. They must be honest about ignorance, know thyself. They must temper power with accountability. When we're talking about the soul, is self-examination. Yeah. But let us accept that humility is not weakness. It is awareness of reality. It is the architecture that prevents the private illusions of the mind from becoming public catastrophes. So from neuron of the brain to nation, for these psychologists, hubris begins in the neuron as a whisper of self-importance. It becomes a pattern of cognition, a distortion of perception, and when multiplied across humans in power, it becomes the force that shapes nations. Psychology explains the how. Political philosophy explains the why and the consequences. Across centuries and disciplines, the lesson is consistent. Unchecked pride, whether in the mind or in the state or in the nation or in the country, destroys what it touches. Simple. The modern world is filled with power, with knowledge and ambition, but without humility, without reflection, without constraint, hubris is inevitable. And when hubris strikes, the fall is universal, and the individual universal from the individual mind to the global system. So history is full of examples where the most powerful never act directly. I'm going to start with Proxies now. The powerful, the ones that we don't see, we see the proxies of power. Yeah? Our politicians, our institutions, they are not the ones up there or down here in control. History is full of examples where the most powerful never act directly. Instead, they manipulate intermediaries, the proxies or followers, to carry out their will. This is not merely strategy, it is psychology applied to social hierarchies. Some obey out of fear, some obey out of loyalty, some obey because the obvious ones, they can be blackmailed or something. Okay, but that is obvious. What is not so obvious is that some obey because they themselves believe that they are the ones in power. Self-deception, when they are actually being manipulated. But they had been chosen because of certain characteristics. Yeah. I'm going to talk about the difference between men. I think I've already said that, men and women. There is a subtle difference in how this mechanism works across genders, shaped by social expectations, ambition, the psychology of pride. Now let's look at the mechanics of proxy power. Inflating the self to serve the will of another. This becomes complex, I know. Inflating the self, but only to serve, imagine, to serve the will of another. Powerful individuals often create what psychologists call illusory agency in their followers. They give the appearance of choice, autonomy, initiative, and the follower, the proxy thinks, I am acting freely, I am accomplishing great things. And the powerful know, very good that you continue to believe so. It serves my purpose. This is not conspiracy theory, this is psychology. This is the essence of political and social manipulation. Hubris in the subordinate person becomes a very effective tool for the dominant person. You don't only have to think about it in terms of politics or what is happening right now, just in terms of relationships. Hubris, this pride in the subordinate, in the follower, in the obedient one, becomes a tool, very effective, for the dominant one. Cognitive and emotional drivers. Several psychological mechanisms make this possible. What is it that they're going to manipulate when they choose you to be the prime minister of your country? Okay, that is why I'm going to study you. Okay, it could be overconfidence bias. Men often overestimate their abilities. And when you give them this person who is overconfident, estimating himself, his own abilities. When you give him a minor little power, a minor little more authority, their sense of competence expands. That's more with men. With women is more recognition seeking. Women are often socialized to value admiration and acknowledgement. I have talked about this ages ago. I was doing so many videos about how what women desire, need is to be admired and so on. I did so many of them that I bored myself and I stopped. But recognition seeking. Women are often socialized to value admiration and acknowledgement. So they pursue influence through visibility, reputation, relational networks. Motivation substitution here, the powerful frame objectives, their objectives, so that the followers' pride or need for recognition or need for admiration aligns with their master's goals. The result is the proxy believes that he's powerful, but his perceived agency has been carefully constructed to benefit someone else. Let's look at men first. Men as inflated agents. Psychological research and historical observation suggest that men are particularly susceptible to what is called illusory authority, illusory power. Small victories, delegated authority, symbolic leadership can convince a man that they are commanding, in control. This perception triggers hubris, which then amplifies risk-taking. It amplifies overconfidence and loyalty to the orchestrator. Politically, militarily, or in business, men who believe they are powerful often act more decisively, though they remain subordinate to the other. So this is good for the other, for the powerful. This is a strategic advantage for those in power. The illusion of autonomy, so easy in men, fuels ambition, aggression, and loyalty, but the real direction of energy remains in the hands of the manipulator. Examples in history, my goodness, generals acting on orders while believing themselves to be brilliant strategies. Corporate middle managers executing top-down strategies while feeling themselves innovative. Political allies carrying out campaigns while believing that they are the ones shaping policy. Women now as admiration-driven proxies. By contrast, women are often socialized to seek recognition, admiration, validation. The powerful can leverage this by constructing prestige or visibility around female proxies. Influence is often mediated by networks, reputation, acknowledgement, rather than direct confrontation. The female proxy's pride is fueled by admiration. Look how important I am, how much others depend on me. Here, hubris is more relational than performative. It depends on social feedback rather than positional power. It often manifests as loyalty, public-facing action, interpersonal management, rather than overt dominance. Always a little bit more sneaky. Examples in history, court advisors or social intermediaries elevated through status symbols, influential women in media or diplomacy leveraging perception to shape outcomes. Female leaders whose authority depends on being recognized and admired, rather than directly commanding. They tend to be a little bit awkward with directly commanding. Okay. So, the psychological dynamics here. Hubris as a tool, pride in men and admiration in women are psychological levers. The projection of competence by making men feel more capable than they are, manipulators convert ambition into obedience. The projection of prestige by making women feel admired, manipulators convert social intelligence into loyalty and coordination. Sustaining the illusion, both men and women remain convinced of their role as independent actors, unaware of the larger orchestration. In essence, hubris is weaponized differently based on different motivational tendencies. The consequences and implications, this strategy produces efficiency for the orchestrator, but can lead to overconfidence, groupthink, misaligned risk-taking in men. It produces networked loyalty, social cohesion, and influence concentration in women. Societies, organizations, political systems are shaped not just by power itself, but by how psychological pride is manipulated within gender roles. So, understanding these mechanisms reveal patterns behind political revolutions orchestrated through charismatic lieutenants, corporate hierarchies exploiting male risk-taking and female network influence, social movements where energy is directed through perceived leaders rather than the actual decision makers. So the universal law of hubris and proxies, the lesson is striking. Hubris is not always dangerous to the individual. Sometimes it is the tool of someone else's design. Men and women are manipulated differently because of the ways they derive pride and self-worth. Power thrives not just by commanding directly, but by shaping the illusions of those who serve. The illusion is subtle, the consequences are profound. The powerful rarely need to act themselves. They simply engineer the hubris of others and let ambition and pride and need of admiration do their bidding. And in this interplay, we see the modern dynamics of influence, hierarchy, and control, not simply who rules, but how rulers orchestrate the minds and the desires of those who believe they are powerful. So, summary: history is full of rulers who never act directly. Instead, they orchestrate, they manipulate and direct others, proxies, who believe they are powerful. Pride, ambition, and desire to be admired become tools. The powerful rarely need to act themselves. They let hubris in others do the work. Power often operates indirectly. The powerful manipulate others to carry out their will, and here is the subtle genius. The proxy believes that he is in control. The strategy is psychological. The follower's hubris, overconfidence, ambition, pride becomes a weapon. In men are particularly susceptible to inflated self-perception. Even small authority or symbolic victories make them feel powerful. Overconfidence bias then kicks in, their sense of competence expands, their risk-taking increases. They act decisively, believing that they are the architects of their own actions. In reality, they are often guided by someone else's design. For women are often motivated differently. Hubris for women frequently comes from admiration, recognition, social prestige. Powerful actors exploit this by giving visibility, status, and acknowledgement. The female proxy feels central, essential, admired, but the real control remains elsewhere. Influence is achieved not through brute action, but through networks, relationships, and the loyalty that admiration creates. This manipulation relies on fundamental psychological mechanisms. Overconfidence bias inflates men's sense of agency. Recognition and social feedback inflate women's sense of influence. The powerful synchronize these illusions with their own objectives, turning pride and admiration into their instruments of control. The consequences are profound. Men driven by inflated confidence can take reckless risks. Women motivated by admiration can consolidate influence in ways that serve other people's agendas. Both increase the efficiency of the orchestrator, but the illusion of autonomy makes detection and resistance unlikely. Hubris becomes a tool, not a flaw. I think I will leave it here. I have so much more, but um, I, I, I hope I have kept it within the hour. Okay, well, thank you very much for listening.